You just made the biggest mistake of your life. That's what the HOA president told me when I refused to paint my grandfather's house her approved shade of beige. I stood in her pristine office surrounded by violation binders, watching her smile like she'd already won. My name is Ezra Thornhill. I've been a water resource consultant for 20 years. I know systems. I know right. And I know exactly what flows beneath this perfect neighborhood of identical roofs and manicured lawns. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the letter that arrived 3 weeks ago, the one that changed everything. Comment below where you're watching this from. The envelope was thick premium white paper with a navy blue HOA seal embossed in the corner. I held it in my kitchen morning light, cutting through the window onto the text inside. Violation number 47. My fence paint was peeling, my grass exceeded 4 inches in height. My work truck sat in my driveway instead of a garage I didn't have. $500 per day until compliance. The final line made my jaw tighten. Continued violations will result in legal action and liens against your property. Signed, Sylvia Drummond, President, Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I set the letter on my kitchen table, the same oak table my grandfather had built in 1968, and looked out at my property. The house was simple wood siding, gone gray in places, a roof that didn't leak windows that worked. It wasn't ugly, just old, and old didn't fit the aesthetic Riverside Meadows was selling to the retirees from California and New York. I'd grown up here when this whole area was ranch land, before developers carved it into quarter-acre lots with covenants and architectural review boards. My property sat right at the edge of their development, technically outside their boundaries, but close enough that they could see it from their evening wine on the patio moments. I walked out back to the small concrete pad where the water system controls sat in a weatherproof box. I opened the box and watched the gauge settle steady. The pump hummed through the metal housing, that same familiar vibration I'd known my entire life. This system had been here since the late 70s, pulling water from the Spring Valley aquifer that ran deep beneath my land. My grandfather drilled the well and built the small station by hand, trusting neighbors more than paperwork. That faith ran deep in the ground as the water itself. When the first families started building homes on what used to be the Morrison Ranch next door, he'd let them tap into his system, no contracts, no fees, just neighborly goodness. That was 40 years ago. Those families are gone now. Riverside Meadows had bought up everything, bulldozed the old houses, and built 200 identical stucco homes with red tile roofs. When they connected their new development to water infrastructure, they'd simply tied into the existing lines without researching who actually owned the source. To them, it was just old pipes in the ground that worked. I closed the control box and stood there listening to the water move through underground pipes, a sound you could only hear if you knew what to listen for. The HOA had no idea. To them, water just came out of faucets. They paid monthly bills to the Riverside Meadows Management Company and assumed it went to some municipal system. They didn't know they were pulling from my aquifer through my pump via lines my grandfather had laid decades ago. I walked the perimeter that afternoon following the fence line. On my side, native grasses and prickly pear. On their side, Bermuda grass that stayed green year-round, rose bushes and beds of red lava rock, and palm trees that had no business in this climate. Sprinkler heads popped up every morning at 6. The community pools through the gaps in their wall, always full, always chlorinated blue. People washing cars and driveways, water running into the street. My water. They were using my water to maintain their perfect aesthetic prison, and now they were fining me for not conforming to it. When I reached the front of my property, I saw her. Sylvia Drummond standing at the end of my driveway with a tablet taking photos. She wore a blazer despite the heat, her blonde hair sprayed into immobility. Her expression set in perpetual disappointment. She saw me and didn't flinch, didn't pretend she wasn't documenting my violations. She lowered the tablet and waited, her posture radiating the confidence that comes from believing you hold all the power. I stopped 10 feet from her and said nothing. She spoke first, her voice pleasant in that professional way that barely hides contempt. Mr. Thornhill, I'm documenting non-compliance issues for our quarterly review. I wanted to give you the courtesy of knowing we take these matters seriously. I looked at her tablet, then at her face, then past her to the Riverside Meadows entrance with its stone columns and brushed metal sign. I said, my voice level, I don't live in your HOA. She smiled tight and controlled. Your property is visible from our community. It impacts our residents' quality of life and property values. We've had complaints. I said complaints aren't violations. She tilted her head slightly, like explaining something to a child. We've taken a community vote. 85% of residents want you to bring your property up to our standards. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I said your vote doesn't have legal authority over my land. Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did, hardening just enough to show what was really happening. We'll find a way, Mr. Thornhill. We protect our community's interests. She walked back toward the HOA entrance, and I stood there watching her go, the envelope still in my back pocket. I pulled it out and read it again this time, noticing what I'd missed before. At the bottom, copied to 15 households, all addresses on the street that bordered my property. She was building social pressure, making sure my neighbors knew I was the problem, the one dragging down their investment. That evening, I sat at my grandfather's table and opened my laptop. I pulled up county records, well permits, water rights certificates I'd inherited with the property. Water rights certificate number 4782AZ, issued in 1979 to the Thornhill Family Trust, granting exclusive extraction rights to the Spring Valley aquifer underlying my property. Maximum permitted extraction, 200,000 gallons per day. Current usage by Riverside Meadows, based on meter readings I'd checked that afternoon, approximately 150,000 gallons per day. They were using my water. They'd been using it for decades, and now they wanted to fine me for not painting my fence. I closed the laptop and looked out my kitchen window at the Riverside Meadows streetlights coming on identical fixtures at precise intervals, illuminating those perfect sidewalks and perfect lawns. Everything in that community ran on systems they didn't understand or own. They believed those systems existed to serve them, never seeing how fragile their comfort was. I thought about Sylvia Drummond's smile and her tablet full of violations. And I thought about the main shutoff valve, the one that controlled water flow to the entire Riverside Meadows development, sitting in that concrete box 50 yards behind my house. I wasn't going to touch it. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I was doing, but I was done pretending their rules applied to me. The second letter arrived 4 days later, violation number 48. This time they had found an issue with the color of my house itself, claiming the natural gray weathered wood created visual discord with the community aesthetic standards. The fine, another $500 per day, brought my running total to $2,000 for the crime of existing near their property line. I read it standing at my mailbox, the desert sun beating down on asphalt that shimmered in the heat. The letter was CC'd to the some 15 households as before, plus 5 more. Sylvia was expanding her audience. 3 days after that violation, 49 arrived. The oak tree in my front yard, the one my grandmother had planted in 1953, had branches extending over my fence line into HOA airspace. They wanted it professionally trimmed to their specifications. Estimated cost, $3,000. I had 72 hours to comply. When I didn't respond, they sent a fourth letter. Violation 50. My work truck, which they'd now classified as a commercial vehicle, violated residential parking aesthetics. The accumulated fines had reached $4,000. Each letter arrived with that same Navy seal, that same loop signature, and an ever-growing list of CC'd addresses. She was methodical about it. I had to give her that. Every piece of mail was a little announcement to the neighborhood that I was the problem, the holdout, the one person preventing their community from achieving its full potential. The social machinery started working exactly as Sylvia had designed it. People washing cars would stop and watch when I drove past. A man watering roses took out his phone and photographed my truck like he was documenting evidence. At the grocery store, I saw Jonah Griffith, late 30s, an accountant I'd known casually for years. When he spotted me in the produce section, his eyes went to his cart, then to the apples he suddenly found fascinating. He gave a tight nod and pushed toward the checkout. In a community where the HOA president had that much influence, being friendly with the neighborhood, pariah had costs. The whispers followed me everywhere, clusters of conversation that stopped when I walked past, then resumed in lower tones. That old house, those violations, property values. It was the same drumbeat at coffee shops and book clubs and evening walks, a chorus of concern that I was damaging their investment by existing in a space I'd occupied long before any of them had arrived. The HOA meeting happened on a Thursday evening. I hadn't planned to attend, but something Jonah had mentioned at the store, probably without meaning to, made me curious. I showed up at 6:30 and stood in the back of the community center, a renovated clubhouse with meeting space and a full kitchen. About 60 people filled the chairs, most of them, over 50, most dressed like they were attending a city council meeting. Sylvia stood at the front with a laptop connected to a projector, her blazer perfectly pressed, her presentation slides already queued up. She started with financial reports, maintenance schedules, upcoming social events. Then she clicked a new slide, and my house filled the screen. It was a photo taken from the street, edited to make the weathered siding look darker, more run down, like something from a cautionary tale. On the other half of the screen, one of the Riverside Meadows homes with its perfect stucco and desert landscaping. The message was clear. This is what we are. That is what threatens us. She let it sit there before speaking. This property represents an ongoing challenge to our community standards. The owner has been notified of multiple violations and has refused to cooperate. Her voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of someone solving a problem rather than creating one. A hand went up in the third row. A woman I didn't recognize asked what could be done about it. Sylvia smiled, controlled, and practiced. We're exploring our legal options. The property technically sits outside our jurisdiction, but it impacts our community's visual coherence and market value. We've documented everything. We're building a case. Another hand, a man in a golf shirt, asking if they could force me to sell. Sylvia's expression didn't change. We're in discussions with our legal counsel about what remedies are available. What I can tell you is that this board will protect your investment and your quality of life. The room murmured approval. I watched from the shadows by the door as she advanced to the next slide. Community action proposal, voluntary relocation incentive. She explained it in the language that sounded helpful and concerned. The HOA would formally request that I consider relocating for the good of the community. They weren't forcing anything, she emphasized. They were simply making it clear that my presence was unwelcome. The vote was open to all residents. Hands went up across the room. She counted slowly, making sure everyone saw the numbers. 78% in favor. The room applauded. I left before the meeting ended, walking out into the parking lot, where the security lights were just starting to hum to life. My truck sat alone at the far end, deliberately parked, away from the cluster of sedans and SUVs. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, watching the people through the community center windows. They were chatting now, smiling, shaking hands. They'd done something important tonight. They'd taken a stand. When I got home, there was an email waiting. Subject line: system inspection required. The HOA needed access to my property to inspect the shared water infrastructure, specifically the pump station they claim was jointly owned community equipment. They wanted their technician to enter my land within 48 hours to assess the system and ensure it met current safety standards. The email was professionally worded, full of technical language about liability and maintenance responsibilities. It was signed by Sylvia and CC'd to the entire HOA board. I read it twice, then opened my file cabinet and pulled out the original 1978 agreement my grandfather had signed with the Morrison family. The language was simple, handwritten on notebook paper, and notarized at the county clerk's office. Permission granted for water access with goodwill, revocable at any time at the discretion of the property owner. I took a photo of it with my phone and replied to the email with a single line: access denied. The pump station is on private property, and you have no legal right to enter. I attached the photo of the original agreement and hit send. The response came 6 minutes later. Mr. Thornhill, refusal to allow necessary safety inspections puts the entire community at risk and may constitute negligence. We strongly advise you to reconsider. This was no longer about fence paint or tree branches. This was about control. She wanted access to my land, wanted her people measuring and documenting and building a case that the water system was somehow communal property. She wanted to establish precedent, create a paper trail that would support whatever legal action she was planning. I closed the laptop and walked out to the pump station, standing there in the dark, listening to the steady hum of the motor. Somewhere in those identical houses, 200 families were washing dishes, taking showers, filling glasses of water, never thinking about where it came from. They believed their monthly payments entitled them to it. They believed the system existed to serve them. I thought about that 78% vote, all those hands going up in that community center. I thought about Jonah Griffith avoiding my eyes in the grocery store, I thought about my house on that projection screen, made to look like something diseased, and I thought about the words in my grandfather's agreement. Revocable at any time. I wasn't ready to revoke anything yet, but I was getting closer. I woke at 6 on a Tuesday morning to silence. Not the normal silence of early desert dawn, but the wrong kind, the kind that meant something had stopped working. I went to the bathroom and turned the faucet. Nothing. No pressure, no sputter, just the hollow sound of air and empty pipes. I stood there for a moment, hands still on the chrome handle, feeling the cold metal under my fingers and understanding what had happened before I even went outside to confirm it. The pump station sat 50 yards behind my house, surrounded by cottonwoods that were just starting to catch the first light. I walked across the dirt in my boots, dew soaking into the cuffs of my jeans, and opened the control panel. The pressure gauge read 0. The flow meter was still. Someone had shut off the main valve and disconnected the feed line that ran to my house. I knelt down and examined the coupling where my personal line split from the main distribution pipe. Fresh tool marks on the fitting still bright against the older rust. Boot prints in the damp soil, 2 sets both larger than mine. On the electrical box that housed the pump controls, someone had taped a printed notice. Warning: unauthorized water connection, disconnected per HOA maintenance protocol, contact management office to restore service. I pulled out my phone and called Sylvia's direct line, the one printed on every violation letter. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and professional, like she'd been awake for hours. "Mr. Thornhill, what can I do for you?" I kept my voice level controlled. "Who authorized work on my property?" There was a pause just long enough for her to adjust her strategy. "I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. I said someone cut my water line." She made a small sound, a concern performed for an invisible audience. "Oh, that's unfortunate. Our maintenance crew disconnected an illegal tap from the community water system. If you've lost service, it's because you were drawing from our infrastructure without permission." I felt something cold move through my chest. Not anger, but something closer to disbelief at the audacity. I said, "That's my water system. That's my aquifer." She didn't miss a beat. "The distribution network is HOA property, Mr. Thornhill. It was built and maintained by our community. If you'd like to apply for a legal connection, you'll need to submit an application, pay the connection fee, and of course bring your property into compliance with community standards. The connection fee is $15,000. I said, "I'm calling the police." She sighed, a small sound of patience wearing thin. "You're welcome to do that. We have documentation showing the work was performed on HOA infrastructure by licensed contractors. This is a civil matter, not criminal. If you'd like to discuss reconnection, my office hours are 9 to 5. She ended the call. I stood there in the morning light, holding my phone, looking at the severed pipe and the notice taped to my equipment. They'd come onto my land at 3 in the morning and cut my water, then had the bureaucratic efficiency to leave paperwork about it. The police arrived an hour later, a single patrol unit with an officer who looked barely old enough to shave. He examined the disconnected line, took photos, read the notice, and wrote everything down in a spiral notebook. When I showed him the property boundaries and explained that the pump station sat on my land, he nodded and kept writing. When I showed him the water rights certificate on my phone, he studied it and handed the phone back. He said, "This looks like a civil dispute, sir. You'll need to contact an attorney." I said they trespassed and vandalized my property. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "The HOA is claiming they worked on their own equipment. Without a clear criminal act, there's not much we can do." He gave me a case number and suggested I document everything. Then he left his patrol car kicking up dust on the road back to town. I called the county water utility office. The woman who answered listened to my explanation, put me on hold twice, then came back with the answer I'd expected. "Sir, your property isn't connected to the municipal water system. We don't have jurisdiction over private wells or HOA managed infrastructure. You'll need to resolve this with your homeowners association." I said I'm not part of the homeowners association. She apologized in that tone people use when they're sorry you're having a problem, but it's definitely not their problem. I hung up and sat on my porch steps looking out at Riverside Meadows, where sprinklers were already running on their timers, arcs of water catching the morning sun like everything was normal. By afternoon, I'd driven to town and bought $40 worth of bottled water. Each chore became a test of patience, measured slow, the kind of quiet frustration that crawled under your skin more than anger ever could. Meanwhile, across the fence line, I could hear the HOA pool filtration system, running that low mechanical hum of pumps, circulating thousands of gallons in endless loops. That evening, I sat in my living room as the light failed outside. I didn't turn on the lamps, just let the darkness come in through the windows, settling into corners and across furniture. The house had never felt this quiet. Without water moving through pipes, without the distant vibration of the pump motor I'd known my entire life, the place felt hollow, like something essential had been removed. He'd built it to last. He just hadn't planned for people like Sylvia Drummond, people who would take your generosity and turn it into a weapon. That night, I stood by the main valve, the metal cool under my palm, the weight of choice heavier than steel. I let go. Some lessons had to come through law, not water pressure. No water for morning showers, no water for coffee, no water for those perfect lawns that needed daily irrigation to stay green in the desert heat. I could do it. I had every legal right to do it. The water was mine, the system was mine, and they'd just proven they had no problem cutting someone off when it served their interests. But I took my hand off the valve and stepped back. I didn't want revenge. I wanted them to understand what they'd actually done. Wanted it demonstrated through proper channels with proper consequences. I wanted the system to work the way it was supposed to work, where facts and law mattered more than social pressure and homeowner votes. I went inside and opened my laptop sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the screen's glow, the only light in the house. I had 20 years of experience in water resource management. I knew the regulations, knew the agencies, knew exactly who to call and what to file. I knew how to build a case that wouldn't just win in court, but would expose every assumption Sylvia and her board had made. They thought I'd give up. They thought I'd sell and move away and let them have their perfect community without the eyesore of my grandfather's house, reminding them that this land had a history before they arrived. They were wrong. I pulled up the State Water Resources website and started reading through the complaint filing process. If they wanted to play by bureaucratic rules, I'd show them what those rules actually said. The file cabinet in my grandfather's office held 40 years of documentation. I'd opened it maybe twice since inheriting the property, never needing anything inside because the systems ran themselves and the agreements were simple. Now I pulled out every folder, spreading them across the kitchen table in the glow of my laptop screen. The well drilling permit from 1978. The aquifer survey my grandfather had commissioned, showing the Spring Valley Formation extending 300 feet below the surface, with an estimated capacity of 5 million gallons. The original handshake agreement with the Morrison family, notarized and filed with the county. And there, in a manila envelope that had yellowed with age, the document that changed everything. Water Rights Certificate number 4782AZ, issued by the Arizona Department of Water Resources to the Thornhill Family Trust, granting exclusive extraction rights to the Spring Valley Aquifer underlying my property. I photographed each page, uploaded them to cloud storage, then read through the certificate line by line. Maximum permitted extraction, 200,000 gallons per day. Current permit holder, Ezra James Thornhill, as trustee. Permit status active and in good standing. I cross-referenced it with the flow meter readings I'd recorded over the past year. Riverside Meadows was pulling an average of 163,000 gallons daily. They were using 82% of my legally permitted water, without authorization, without payment, without even knowing they were doing it. I opened the Arizona Revised Statutes and searched for the relevant sections. Title 33, Chapter 12, Section 1234. Unauthorized use of water resources constitutes civil theft, punishable by fines and potential criminal charges. Any person or entity using water without proper rights or permits may be held liable for damages, including fair market value of water use, legal fees, and punitive damages. I did the math on a notepad, old school, because sometimes you need to see numbers written by hand to believe them. Commercial water rates in Arizona averaged $4 per 1,000 gallons. 163,000 gallons per day times $4 times 365 days. $237,000 per year. They'd been using my water for at least 15 years since the development was built. I stopped calculating after that because the numbers became absurd, but the legal principle was clear. They owed me. They owed me for every gallon that had run through their sprinklers and filled their pools and washed their cars, while my grandfather's generosity was reinterpreted as their entitlement. I found the attorney through a colleague, another water resource consultant who dealt with rights disputes in Tucson. Her name was on the website, credentials listed in a clean sans serif font. Stanford Law, 20 years specializing in water rights and property law, 3 successful cases against HOAs in the past 5 years. I called her office at 8 in the morning. The receptionist put me through after a brief hold. Her voice was professional, efficient, no wasted words. Meredith Crane speaking. I explained the situation in 5 minutes, hitting the key points. HOA cut my water. They're using my aquifer without rights. I have full documentation. She asked 3 questions. Do you have the water rights certificate? Yes. Do you have proof they're using your water? Yes. Do you have evidence they cut your line? Yes. She said I can file for a temporary restraining order by the end of business today. It'll cost $5,000 up front. I'll need all your documentation within the hour. I said you'll have it in 20 minutes. She said good and gave me her email address. I spent the next hour scanning documents, organizing files, and writing a timeline of events from the first violation letter to the cut water line. I included photos of the disconnected pipe, screenshots of Sylvia's emails, copies of all the violation notices. I attached the flow meter data showing Riverside Meadows' daily usage, the water rights certificate, and the original Morrison agreement. When I hit send, the email was 12 megabytes of evidence. My phone rang 10 minutes later. Meredith's voice had changed sharper now, energized. This is solid. They cut your water line while actively stealing your water. The irony is almost too perfect. She said she'd draft the complaint and the TRO motion file both with the county court and have a hearing scheduled within 72 hours. She said, understand that once we file this, it becomes public record. The HOA will know you're serious. I said good and gave her my credit card number. I walked out to the pump station and stood there in the mid-morning heat, looking at the valve I'd touched but not turned the night before. I wasn't going to turn it now either, but I needed to document exactly how it worked. I took photos of the main shutoff, the distribution manifold, the pressure regulators that controlled flow to different sections of Riverside Meadows. I sketched a diagram showing how water moved from the aquifer through my pump to their homes. I noted the meter location, the coupling where my personal line had been severed, the electrical panel that powered everything. This was my system. I'd maintained it, replaced parts when they failed, paid the power bill that kept the pump running 24 hours a day. They'd contributed nothing except the assumption that water was their right simply because they'd moved here and built houses. I thought about turning that valve, how easy it would be, how justified. They'd cut my water without warning, without legal process in the middle of the night. I could do the same thing right now, and it would be completely legal because the water was mine to control, but I didn't touch it. Not because they didn't deserve it, but because I wanted something better than revenge. I wanted them to understand through official channels and legal consequences that systems have owners, that resources have sources, that their perfect community was built on someone else's property and someone else's generosity. I wanted a judge to tell them they were wrong. I wanted state inspectors to document their theft. I wanted it in writing in court records and legal precedent that would follow them long after this was resolved. I went back inside and drafted an email to a local reporter whose byline I'd seen in the regional paper. Her stories focused on local government and community issues, the kind of journalism that actually investigated instead of just reprinting press releases. I kept it factual. HOA cuts water to the property owner who actually owns the water source the entire community uses. I attached the key documents, the water rights certificate, a photo of the disconnected line, and my contact information. I didn't send it yet. That was the reserve option, the public exposure route if the legal approach didn't move fast enough. But I wanted it ready, wanted the story written and waiting, so that when the time came, I could hit send and watch what happened when sunlight hit Sylvia's careful narrative. That night I installed 3 security cameras around the pump station, wireless units that uploaded to cloud storage. I positioned them to cover all approaches, the valve assembly and the electrical panel. If anyone from the HOA came back to tamper with anything, I'd have video proof with timestamps. I installed a 4th camera covering my driveway, aimed so it would catch anyone approaching my house. The cameras had motion sensors and night vision. They were the kind of thing I should have installed months ago, but I'd never thought I'd need them. I'd thought my neighbors were neighbors, that property rights meant something, that people didn't just take what wasn't theirs because a vote said they could. I sat on my porch steps as evening came, on drinking water from a plastic bottle, because that was my reality now, and watched the Riverside Meadows streetlights come on in sequence. Identical fixtures, identical spacing, identical everything. The place was built to run smooth, predictable, unquestioned, until something really pushed back. But systems have sources. Infrastructure has owners. And I was about to teach them that lesson in the most thorough, documented, legally binding way possible. Day 7. Without water in my house and my attorney called at 9 in the morning. We're filing today. The hearing for the temporary restraining order is set for tomorrow at 10. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by empty water bottles, and felt something shift in my chest, like a machine engaging after a long pause. She walked me through what would happen. The complaint named Riverside Meadows HOA, Sylvia Drummond personally, and the management company as defendants. Charges included trespassing, destruction of property, theft of water resources, and interference with legal water rights. The TRO would compel them to restore my water immediately. The lawsuit sought $250,000 in damages plus legal fees. She said they'll receive service this afternoon. Be prepared for contact. I said I won't answer. She said good. At 2:15, my phone started ringing. Sylvia's number, the HOA office. 2 numbers I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail. At 3:30, an email arrived from the HOA's attorney. Mr. Thornhill, we've received notice of legal action and believe this can be resolved through mediation rather than costly litigation. Please contact our office. I forwarded it to my attorney without responding. She replied within minutes. Ignore them. They're trying to negotiate before the judge sees evidence. At 4 o'clock, a certified letter arrived. Emergency HOA board meeting. All homeowners invited to discuss water system dispute. Tonight, 7 p.m. I left it unopened and drove into town. The newspaper office was in an old brick building downtown, 2nd floor above a coffee shop. The reporter was at her desk, surrounded by marked-up documents. I'd emailed her the day before with the basics and documentation. She stood when I walked in. I've been reading your files. This is remarkable. We sat in a conference room. She had a notebook and asked permission to record, then let me talk. I walked through the timeline, the violation letters, the escalating fines, the vote to pressure my relocation, the 3 a.m. disconnection, the fact that every drop of water in Riverside Meadows came from an aquifer I owned. She took notes, stopping occasionally for clarification. How long has your family owned the property? How much water does the HOA use daily? Do they know they're using your water? I answered each question with documentation, pulling up photos on my phone, showing the water rights certificate, flow meter, data images of the cut pipe. She asked to photograph me at my property. We drove separately and met an hour before sunset. She worked professionally setting up careful shots. Me standing next to the disconnected line. Me holding the water rights certificate in front of the pump station. Me in my kitchen with bottled water cases stacked, while HOA sprinklers ran through the window behind me. She recorded a short video interview, asked me to explain what happened in my own words. I kept my voice level, factual, except when I mentioned my grandfather's generosity, being repaid with midnight trespassing. She said this runs tomorrow morning online by 6 a.m. I said thank you. She said I'm just reporting what's documented. At 7 o'clock, I watched cars fill the community center parking lot. Dozens of them people arriving for the emergency meeting to discuss me. I didn't attend. I sat on my porch in the dark and watched those lit windows, all those people gathered, to decide what story they wanted to believe. My phone buzzed with an email from a neighbor I barely knew, someone who lived deep in Riverside Meadows. The subject line is the news story. The message was apologetic. Mr. Thornhill, I saw the article posted tomorrow. My wife and I want you to know not everyone agrees with what the HOA did. We think you've been treated unfairly. We're voting against further action. I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner. He signed with his full name and address, willing to be identified as someone who disagreed with the majority. The article went live at 6 the next morning. I read it on my phone while boiling water for instant coffee. The headline was clean and factual. Local HOA cuts. Water to homeowners who owns their water source. The reporter had written it exactly as I'd explained, no sensationalism, just documented facts in order. The HOA had issued escalating violations. They'd voted to pressure relocation. They'd cut water to my house while using my water for their community. The article included a photo of me holding the water rights certificate with the pump station visible behind me. It quoted from the certificate the Arizona Water Statutes, the original Morrison Agreement. It noted the lawsuit and hearing. It ended simply. Thornhill declined to shut off water to Riverside Meadows, despite having legal authority to do so, stating he prefers to resolve this through proper legal channels. By 8 a.m., my phone was flooded with notifications. The article had been shared to community forums, local groups, and regional news aggregators. Comments filled with people sharing their own HOA stories. A few defended Sylvia, arguing communities needed standards, but most comments ran the other way. How can an HOA cut someone's water when they don't own it? This is theft. I hope he sues them. By 9 a.m., 3 television stations had called for interviews. I declined all of them. The newspaper article was enough. The HOA email came at 9:30, sent to all residents. Dear Riverside Meadows residents, you may have seen misleading reports regarding a dispute with a neighboring property owner. We want to assure you the HOA acted within its rights to maintain community infrastructure. The individual in question has been uncooperative and is now making false claims to avoid legitimate violations. We are confident the courts will see through this tactic. Your board remains committed to protecting property values and community standards. Signed by Sylvia. I forwarded it to my attorney. She called back in minutes. They're digging deeper. This helps us. Keep that email. At 10 o'clock, I received an email from the accountant who'd avoided me at the grocery store. Subject line, I'm sorry. The message was longer than expected. Mr. Thornhill, I read the article this morning. I've lived at Riverside Meadows 5 years and had no idea where our water came from. I certainly didn't know the HOA cut your line. What they did was wrong. I spoke up at last night's meeting and got shouted down, but I want you to know some of us don't agree with this. I wish I'd said something sooner. I'm voting against further action and told the board they need to apologize and negotiate in good faith. He signed with his full name and phone number. I read it twice, then saved it. The tide was shifting, not with everyone. Maybe not even the majority, but enough that Sylvia's unanimity was cracking. The rest of the day felt like waiting for a visible storm. I organized files, reviewed evidence, backed up documents in multiple locations. At 4 o'clock, my attorney called. Tomorrow's hearing, dress business casual. Bring nothing, say nothing, unless the judge addresses you directly. I'll handle the talking. They're going to argue you're exaggerating, and the system is communal. We're going to bury them with evidence. I said I'll be there. She said this is going to work. Trust the system. I hung up and looked out at Riverside Meadows, at sprinklers running their afternoon cycle, at perfect lawns and identical houses, and people who believed their fees entitled them to whatever made their lives comfortable. Tomorrow, a judge would tell them otherwise. Tomorrow, the law would do what it's supposed to do, protect actual rights instead of perceived ones. I just had to wait. The county courthouse was an old building with high ceilings and wooden benches, worn smooth by decades of disputes. I arrived at 9:30 and found my attorney waiting outside courtroom 3, documents organized in color-coded folders. She looked up when I approached. They're already inside with their lawyer. Don't react to anything they say. Let me handle it. We walked in at 9:55. Sylvia sat at the defendant's table with 3 board members and their attorney, a man in an expensive suit who radiated the confidence that comes from winning through attrition. The bailiff called us to order, and the judge entered a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd heard every variation of human conflict. My attorney stood and presented our case in clinical language. The defendant, HOA, cut water service to my client's property while simultaneously using water from an aquifer my client legally owns. She held up the water rights certificate. This document grants exclusive extraction rights to Ezra Thornhill. She presented photos of the disconnected line with timestamps and tool marks visible. This work was performed without permission at approximately 3 a.m. She presented flow meter data showing 163,000 gallons daily usage without authorization. She presented the violation letters, emails, and meeting notices. The defendant engaged in a systematic campaign to pressure my client into compliance with standards that have no legal authority over his property. We asked the court to issue a temporary restraining order compelling immediate restoration of water service. The HOA attorney stood and began a prepared speech. Your Honor, this dispute has been escalated by the plaintiff's refusal to cooperate with reasonable community standards. The water system was installed decades ago and maintained by the association, My clients believed the infrastructure was communal property. When they discovered an unauthorized connection, they acted to protect community resources. The plaintiff lives in a property that impacts the visual character and property values of 200 families. We believe mediation is more appropriate than court orders. The judge looked at him over her glasses. Do you have documentation showing ownership of the water rights? He hesitated. Your Honor, our position is that long-term use establishes shared ownership. The judge turned to my attorney. Counselor, do you have the original agreements? My attorney presented the Morrison Agreement. This explicitly states that water access is revocable at any time by the property owner. The judge read both documents, examined the photos, then addressed the HOA attorney directly. Your client cut water to a property owner who holds legal water rights while using that owner's water for their community. Do you understand how that looks? The attorney said weakly, we believed we were protecting community infrastructure. The judge said you were wrong. She signed the order. Temporary restraining order granted. The defendant will restore water service within 24 hours and is prohibited from interfering with the plaintiff's property. A full hearing on damages will be scheduled within 30 days. She looked at Sylvia and the board members. You should have verified ownership before you cut anyone's water. The court adjourned. 20 minutes of hearing, 40 years of assumptions corrected. My attorney shook my hand in the hallway. They have 24 hours. If they don't comply, we can hold them in contempt. I drove home and found 2 contractor trucks already in my driveway. The technicians who had cut my line were reconnecting it, working quickly, avoiding eye contact. One younger worker glanced at me and said quietly, Sorry about this, man. We just do what they tell us. I said I know. It's not your fault. They finished in 40 minutes, tested the pressure, had me sign the work order, and left. I went inside and turned on the kitchen faucet. Water ran clear and cold. The pressure steady, the sound of it filling the sink, like something I'd taken for granted until it was gone. I washed my hands, filled a glass, and drank it standing at the window. The system was mine again. It had always been mine. The state inspection happened 3 days later. The inspector arrived with a clipboard and measuring kit, methodical and thorough. He reviewed the water rights certificate, inspected the pump station, tested water quality, and examined my maintenance logs. He asked how long the HOA had been using my water. I said at least 15 years. He said they never applied for extraction permits. That's a significant violation. He traced the distribution lines from my pump to Riverside Meadows, documented every connection, then sat in his truck typing for 20 minutes before printing 2 violation notices. The first was for unauthorized extraction from a permitted aquifer. Fine, $50,000. The second was for operating an unregistered distribution system. Fine, $25,000. The HOA had 90 days to negotiate a legal agreement with me, find an alternative water source, or cease operations. He said they'll receive these by certified mail tomorrow. I said, what if they don't comply? He said we shut down their system and fine them daily. Water rights are serious business in Arizona. That evening, another emergency HOA meeting took place. By the end, residents had voted to remove Sylvia, 156 in favor. She packed her folders and left without a word. The accountant called, still stunned. She lost it all in 20 minutes. I said, that's what happens when power's built on what isn't yours. 5 days later, Jonah Griffith, now interim president, called. His tone was careful, almost humble. He wanted to meet about the water. I agreed on my property near the pump. I wanted the conversation to be where the source really was. He arrived at 2 o'clock driving a sedan that looked like it had car seats recently removed from the back, the kind of vehicle that suggested family obligations and practical decisions. He was younger than I'd thought, from our brief grocery store encounter, late 30s, wearing business casual clothes that didn't quite fit right, like he'd dressed for a job interview he hadn't expected to need. I met him at the pump station. He looked at the equipment, the control panel, the meters, taking it in with the expression of someone seeing infrastructure they'd used without understanding. He said, I didn't know any of this was here. I said, most people don't think about where water comes from until they don't have it. He nodded slowly. That's fair. That's more than fair, actually. He looked at me directly. What Sylvia did was wrong. What the board did was wrong. I voted against some of it, not all of it, and I'm sorry for that. I should have spoken up louder and sooner. We walked to my back porch and sat in the shade. I offered water, and he accepted, drank it with a small, ironic smile that acknowledged what we both knew. that every drop in his glass came from the aquifer beneath us. He said the board authorized me to negotiate a formal agreement. We understand we've been using your water without permission. We understand the state has given us 90 days to fix that. We want to make this right. I said, tell me what you're proposing. He pulled out a folder, not Sylvia's organized binders, but loose papers that looked like they'd been drafted in multiple emergency meetings. We're proposing a 30-year water service agreement. The HOA would pay you $2 per 1,000 gallons, which is 50% below commercial rates. You'd maintain control of the system and the aquifer rights. We'd cover all maintenance costs for the distribution infrastructure, and we'd commit in writing never to interfere with your property rights again. He paused. We know this is more generous than we deserve. We're hoping you'll consider it anyway. I looked at the numbers he'd written out. $2 per 1,000 gallons on 163,000 daily usage worked out to about $326 per day, roughly $10,000 per month, $120,000 per year. For water, I'd been giving away for free that my grandfather had given away for free because he'd believed neighbors helped neighbors. I said, you'll pay for all the system maintenance, pumps, pipes, electrical, everything. He said yes, all of it. I said, and the HOA drops any claims about my property appearance or violations. He said already done. The new board rescinded every violation notice you received. We're also amending the HOA bylaws to prevent this from happening to anyone else. I said, show me the amendments. He pulled out another document, this one more carefully formatted. I read through it slowly. Prohibition on using HOA authority for personal retaliation. Requirement for 2/3 vote on major financial decisions. Cap on aesthetic violation fines at $100. Protection for properties outside HOA boundaries. Financial transparency with quarterly reports to all residents. I said this is better than most HOA governing documents I've seen. He said we had help from people who've dealt with bad boards before. We're trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. I thought about it for a long moment. Looking out at the land my grandfather had worked the water system he'd built, the generosity he'd shown that had been repaid with midnight trespassing and violation notices. I thought about Sylvia's face in that courtroom, about the judge's gavel hitting wood, about systems working the way they were supposed to when you use them correctly. I said 30 years is a long time. What happens if the board changes and someone like Sylvia comes back? He said the agreement will be legally binding and recorded with the county. Any board that violates it opens the HOA to immediate lawsuit. Plus, the new bylaws require board decisions to go through resident vote. No more unilateral authority. I said I want a clause that allows me to terminate with 90 days notice if the HOA violates any terms. He nodded. That's fair. We'll add it. I said, then I'll sign it. The formal signing happened in an attorney's office 2 weeks later. Not my attorney's office and not the HOA's, but a neutral location with a notary public and witnesses. I signed. Jonah signed as board president. 2 board members signed as witnesses. The notary stamped it with that solid thunk that makes things official. My attorney reviewed it one final time and said, this is one of the better HOA agreements I've seen. You protected yourself while still helping the community. I said my grandfather would have wanted the community to have water. He just would have wanted to be respected while providing it. We filed copies with the county recorder with the State Water Resources Department with both sets of attorneys. It was done. The HOA sent a formal apology letter to all residents 2 days later. I received a copy addressed to me personally. We acknowledged that the previous board's actions toward Ezra Thornhill were inappropriate and legally wrong. Mr. Thornhill has been unfairly targeted, and we take full responsibility for the harm caused. We have reached a fair agreement for continued water service and have implemented new bylaws to prevent similar actions in the future. We apologize to Mr. Thornhill and to all residents who were misled about this situation. It was signed by the entire new board. I folded it and put it in the file cabinet with all the other documents, the whole paper trail of how power worked when it worked correctly, how systems corrected themselves when people demanded they do so, how justice was possible if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and had the documentation to prove you were right. 6 months had passed since the agreement was signed, and autumn had settled over the desert with cooler mornings and light that turned golden earlier in the afternoon. I sat on my porch in the late-day sun, coffee cup in hand, looking out at riverside meadows. The sprinkler systems still ran on their schedules, but now they ran legally water flowing through lines that had been inspected and certified by the state paid for at rates we'd both agreed on. The sound of water moving through underground pipes was constant familiar, the same sound I'd known my entire life. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a correction, like something that had been tilted back to level. The neighborhood had changed in small ways that added up to something larger. Mrs. Iris Pemberton, the oldest resident in Riverside Meadows, had started a tradition of bringing me baked goods once a month. She'd shown up the first time in September with apple pie, explaining that she remembered my grandfather and had been horrified by what the previous board had done. She'd lived here 40 years back when it was still ranch land, and people knew each other by name instead of address. She said we used to help each other, then we forgot how. I'm glad we're remembering. I invited her in for coffee, and we talked about the old days, about her husband who'd worked cattle with my grandfather, about how communities worked when they were built on relationships instead of rules. Jonah had called a week after the agreement was finalized to ask if I'd consider joining the new Community Water Committee, a small group formed to oversee the system and handle maintenance coordination. I'd declined as politely as I could. I'm not a committee person, I'd told him, but if there's ever a technical problem, call me directly. I'll always help with that. He'd understood, said he appreciated it, said the offer stood permanently if I changed my mind. The new board met monthly now and published detailed financial reports that residents could actually read and understand. The violation enforcement had become reasonable, focused on genuine safety issues rather than aesthetic conformity. People were starting to paint their houses different colors. Someone 3 streets in had put up a vegetable garden that would have triggered a violation under Sylvia's rules, but now was just accepted as part of the neighborhood diversity. I'd heard about Sylvia through indirect channels, the way you hear about people who leave a place under difficult circumstances. She'd moved to a different community an hour north somewhere, with even stricter HOA rules and even more uniformity. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I didn't feel much of anything except a kind of distant understanding that some people need control more than they need connection. And when they lose that control, they don't learn from it. They just find new places to exercise it. Jonah had told me she'd sent him an email before she left. Something about how she'd been trying to protect property values and believed she'd been doing the right thing. She'd written that she'd learned she was too invested in perfection to see the humanity underneath. It was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd heard from her, and I hoped it meant something would change in how she saw the world. But I didn't know. People's patterns run deep. The system itself had been upgraded with money from the water agreement. New pump motors with better efficiency, updated pressure regulators, a monitoring system that sent alerts to my phone if anything went wrong. The HOA had paid for all of it as contracted, and Jonah had insisted I oversee the work to make sure it was done correctly. We'd hired a good contractor, someone who understood aquifer systems and desert hydrology, and the result was infrastructure that would last another 40 years if maintained properly. The distribution network had been mapped and documented, every valve and junction recorded in digital files that both the HOA and I had copies of. It was transparent now, visible no longer just old pipes in the ground that people assumed belonged to whoever collected the monthly fees. As evening came on, I walked out to the pump station one last time before dark. The fall air was cool enough that I could see my breath in the shadows under the cottonwoods. I opened the control panel and checked the gauges by habit. 45 psi, flow steady at 120 gallons per minute. Everything exactly as it should be. I closed the panel and stood there listening to the water move. That low sound you only heard if you knew what to listen for. And I could almost see him here watching the same sunset over open land, before fences and bylaws. He'd built this system to last. He'd shared it because that's what neighbors did. He'd never imagined it would become a point of legal conflict, but he'd also documented everything carefully enough that, when the conflict came, the truth was provable. I walked back toward my house as the streetlights in Riverside Meadows began coming on in sequence, identical fixtures at identical intervals, but somehow less oppressive now that the community behind them had changed. Lights came on in my own windows, the warm glow of lamps I'd turned on before walking outside. My house still looked old against the backdrop of new construction. My fence was still unpainted. My truck still sat in the driveway. But nobody was sending violation notices anymore. Nobody was taking photos for quarterly reviews. The house was just a house, the fence was just a fence, and I was just a person living on land my family had held for 3 generations. Inside, I sat at my grandfather's oak table and opened my laptop. There was an email from the reporter who'd written the original story. Her article about the case had won a regional journalism award for local investigative reporting. She had thanked me in her acceptance speech for trusting her with the documentation. The email said, "I wanted you to know I've received dozens of messages from people in other HOA communities who've used your case as a template for challenging overreach in their neighborhoods. You changed more than just your situation." I read it twice, then closed the laptop. I hadn't set out to change anything beyond my own circumstances. I just refused to accept that a vote by strangers gave them authority over my property and my rights. But if other people found something useful in that refusal, something that helped them stand up to systems that had stopped serving the people they were supposed to serve, then maybe the whole ordeal had been worth more than just restoring water pressure. I turned off the lights one by one, the house settling into the evening quiet. Through the kitchen window, I could see the community center lights still on, another meeting happening, people gathered to make decisions about their shared spaces. But it was different now. The decisions were being made collectively, transparently, with the understanding that communities were built on mutual respect rather than forced compliance. Water flowed beneath all of it, ancient and patient, caring nothing for human disputes or human resolutions. It just flowed. We were the ones who decided whether to share it with grace or hoard it with force. My grandfather had chosen grace, Sylvia had chosen force, I'd chosen law, and in the end, the law had chosen grace.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe.